The Eye Collectors by Simon Kewin. Chapter 1. The First Victim. The killer had extracted the victim's eyes. That got my attention. Also the pentagram daubed around the body in what I doubted was red paint. I'd been summoned to the crime scene without much expectation of finding anything significant. You'd be surprised how often it happens. A murder with hints of ritual, a few bizarre or inexplicable circumstances, and some investigating officer in the know will murmur, "What do you think? One for the Witchfinders?" And another investigating officer in the know will purse their lips, pause, then nod, only too happy to have a potentially troublesome case handed over. And then I'll discover the victim's jealous spouse buried that knife in the victim's neck because they'd been unfaithful or abusive or just plain irritating. And that's all there is to it. Nothing arcane, no forbidden arts perverting the natural order, nothing. That's basically how it always goes, except occasionally it doesn't. I crouched beside the body, feeling ridiculous in my white crime scene onesie. Not clothing that would normally be much use or protection to me. Still, I was careful not to touch anything in case the investigation did turn out to be a simple matter of hair follicles and fingerprints and mere criminal laws. The complete lack of blood spatter intrigued me. Murder is a messy business, but there was no blood anywhere apart from in that spell circle. Whoever carried out this mutilation knew what they were doing. At the very least, it had to be the work of a surgeon or someone else used to taking a scalpel to the soft tissues of the human body. Which, okay, didn't mean anything unnatural was involved. Maybe the victim had particularly beautiful eyes and some crazy wanted them for their private collection. Or maybe the victim had witnessed something they shouldn't have, and the murderer wanted to really emphasise the point. I don't know. People kill people for all sorts of reasons. But the removal of both eyes reminded me of something. I resisted the temptation to call it instinct. That was magical thinking, within shouting distance of superstition. It was what we in the office existed to stamp out. No, it was some half-remembered case from the archives, or some investigation I wasn't privileged enough to have full access to. It didn't help that I hadn't slept much, and that thinking straight was like trying to see through a fog rolling in off the Bristol Channel. I haven't told you the date. Let me tell you the date. The 31st of October, All Hallows Eve, Samhain, Halloween. The date when the veils between the worlds weaken and all leave in the office is cancelled. I had my own reasons for dreading the date. On top of all that, it was my birthday, and that was bad because it meant it would have been my brother's birthday too. I forced my attention back to the body. The victim was a 30-ish guy, handsome if you excused his lack of eyes. He lay on his back, hands by his sides, as if he'd made himself comfortable and nodded off. It was hard not to read an expression of wide-eyed amazement upon his ruined face. Disbelief at how his day had gone. He wasn't clean-shaven, but his stubble was trimmed, deliberate. His suit was tailored, fashionably skinny, and his new leather shoes shone. All of which was odd in itself. The house was a boarded-up hovel in a row of boarded-up hovels, in a part of Cardiff where most of the terraces had been demolished in the 1960s and the 1970s to make room for tower blocks. So, a pimp or a drug dealer, maybe. Perhaps he'd walked right into some rival street gang's ambush. "This thing with the eyes," I said, "is that the calling card of any of the local mobsters?" A uniformed officer squatted beside me. He was no one I knew. From what I could see of his features, he looked like he was maybe only a few years out of university, so about my age. Chances were he wasn't on the inside, and he thought I was from some specialist police unit, rather than a completely separate arm of government, not subject to Heatherly lines of command. The misunderstanding often came in handy. "Never seen anything like this," he said, voice muffled through his mask. "When the local bastards want to make a point, they don't go in for delicate surgery. They go in for as much gore as possible. Right bloody animals they are." I leaned in closer to examine the eye sockets, picking up the faint tang of a caustic chemical even through my mask. The eyeballs had been removed recently. The only blood was a dried trickle of watery red down the left side of the man's head. Someone had gone to the trouble of cleaning up as they went along, just as a surgeon would. Most likely, there'd been more than one of them, one to cut, one to swab. "Who alerted you to the crime?" "It was sheer luck. They're planning to knock this terrace down, and someone from the company came in to make sure no one was squatting." "That's quite a coincidence." "I suppose it is." Then there was the pentagram. The victim lay in its exact centre, head to the south. Either he'd been placed within it, or it had been drawn around him. The former seemed more likely. I'd only seen a few mystic circles in my 3 years with the office, but that was enough to tell the difference between a fake and one humming with real power. This was the genuine article, emblazoned with sigils conveying screams of torment when glimpsed from the corner of your eye. I was too lowly to be trusted with full knowledge of the forbidden alphabets, but I had some inkling of what I was looking at. The pentagram sent a chill shivering through me, made my testicles contract walnut tight. Something malign had taken place in this room. The other person crouching beside the body was a forensics officer, currently photographing the corpse from every conceivable angle. Strictly speaking, if she took any shots of the pentagram, she was committing a serious Majesty law offence. Reproducing prescribed symbols of power with intent could be punishable by immediate dispatch to oblivion. I was pretty sure she had no clue about the significance of the runes. She would probably comb them for fingerprints or stray hairs, utterly oblivious to the howling agonies they hinted at. But I instructed her not to reproduce the symbols in any way and to delete any pictures she had taken. Her response was a raised eyebrow. Lines of command between the office and other law enforcement bodies can be hazy, but in such matters we absolutely have the final say. I directed her to discuss the matter with her commanding officer if she had any concerns, to which she shrugged and returned to her work. "He was killed recently?" I asked. She at least managed to keep her voice civil. "This morning, maybe last night." "Too soon to work out a cause of death?" "Hard to say without turning him over or opening him up. Apart from the eyes, there are no wounds or marks visible. I'd guess he was poisoned before that was done to him." "You think he was dead when his eyes were removed?" "I'd say that's likely. It would have been impossible to make such neat incisions with a struggling victim." "He might have been unconscious." "He'd have bled heavily from such wounds with his heart still pumping. My guess is that the murderer incapacitated him, extracted his blood to paint the magic circle, then took his eyes, by which time he was probably dead from blood loss." "Have you found a puncture hole?" "Not so far." She hadn't mentioned the most likely explanation of what had happened, that the victim had been slain by some ritual of death sorcery, or merely paralysed. Perhaps he'd been conscious throughout, aware but unable to move even as the scalpel approached and his tormentor began the work of cutting away his eyelids, severing the muscles wrapping around his eyeballs. Still seeing, maybe, even as his eyes were pulled from his skull attached only by their optic nerves. It was the sort of grim detail the deviants we pursue revel in, some essential component of the sorcery, or simply the arrogant sadism of those who don't feel bound by normal human laws. Blood collection for ritual purposes is a common enough feature of such crimes, and I'd studied 3 or 4 cases where magic was used to carefully drain a victim of their blood so that runes could be drawn. I kept these thoughts to myself. Do you know who he is? Was, I mean? Not at this point. We might get something from his fingerprints if he's been a bad lad. Thanks for your help. Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. I took out my phone and took pictures of my own, making sure to capture each rune in close-up. At my level, I just about had clearance to reproduce the marks so long as the shots remained upon authorised office equipment, and I used them only for the purposes of investigation. I had to be very careful. If they got into the public domain, it would be me never seeing the light of day again. The forensics officer looked baffled at my actions, but said nothing. I looked around the room to see if there was anything I'd missed. The smallest detail could be significant, and they might well be things a police officer would overlook. It was a sad, shabby little place. My mask almost kept out the mouldy smell. Square lines of light filtered in through metal sheeting screwed to the window frames. The floorboards were bare, and there was no furniture apart from a yellow armchair, worn and peppered with cigarette burns. It was a grim place for your whole life to lead to, a sad end. The walls were bare plaster, and someone had made soot marks upon them with a cigarette lighter or a candle. They didn't look like anything relevant. It was hard to know how long they'd been there, but I photographed them just in case. There was a small pile of grubby, stained bedding in one corner. At some point, someone had slept in that room, although probably not, I guessed, the sharply dressed man lying on the floor. Nevertheless, the police had marked the bedding off in chalk, drawing a circle with a different sort of power around it. It was then, turning to look around the room, that I had one of my episodes. Let me tell you about them. I don't know if they're migraines, or epileptic fits, or some sort of mild psychotic episode. So far, medicine hasn't found a good explanation. The attacks usually hit me at times of stress, or when I've witnessed something traumatic, or when I haven't slept well. They're like this. The world around me goes dark, but the shadows get brighter, dancing and lurching and laughing. Sometimes there are voices blaring disjointed cries, and sometimes there are faces looming from the gloom to shout into my face. There are words, but I don't understand them, garbled syllables of a confused tongue. The words carry with them a weight of nausea, sometimes enough to make me retch and vomit. Pretty insane stuff. The first few times it happened, I was terrified, thinking I was going crazy. These days I'm calmer. I know it'll pass. The episodes can last for 10 or 20 minutes, but quite often only a few seconds go by. The people I'm with might not even notice. They'll just think I'm not paying attention, my thoughts wandering for a moment. I've got used to covering my affliction up. The visions this time were unsettling. There's a nightmare quality to the scenes my brain conjures up, a twisted version of reality. Dizziness whirled through me. The victim on the floor was still alive. He was pinned to the ground by his hands and feet, white-sleeved arms restraining him. He screamed and writhed to escape, but could not. There was a deep-throated terror to his ragged cries. There was also a knife. I saw it in sudden close-up, filling my vision, the ornately carved handle and the shining keenness of its blade. Then the weapon was held over the victim, letting him see. He stopped struggling, like he was paralysed, as the blade was brought towards his body, his face, his eyes. As soon as it came, the episode dissipated, and I was back in the room, left only with a sickness in my stomach and blood thundering in my head. I panted like I'd been running, and Detective Inspector Nikola Zubrasky, the investigating officer who'd called me in, was watching me from the doorway with an intrigued look on her face. I forced myself to breathe slowly and stepped towards her. Zubrasky was on the inside and knew at least something about the workings of the office. Knew we existed at any rate. We'd cooperated on a couple of cases over the past year, neither of them amounting to much. Also, although she didn't know it, I'd thoroughly investigated her background as one of my first assignments in the office. She'd had a string of striking successes, made impressive arrests, and alarm bells had rung. She wouldn't have been the first to use the forbidden arts to cheat her way to professional success. There were plenty of rumours on that score about every politician you could name. But Zubrasky had been clean. She was simply good at her job. There was Irish blood in her parentage, as well as Eastern European, explaining her autumnal red hair, her green eyes. That, in turn, may have explained our suspicions. 300 years ago, such characteristics might have spelled witch to those too ignorant to know better. I was fairly sure we'd moved on since then, although sometimes I wondered. We were supposed to be as inclusive and meritocratic as any modern organisation, yet the office was still largely run by old white guys. I mean, okay, I had my Indian ancestry, but I'd never been any farther east than Great Yarmouth. And to be honest, Norfolk seems pretty foreign to me. I only hoped Zubrasky hadn't found out I'd investigated her. Our techniques are thorough, and I knew everything there was to know about her. Partners, medical records, affiliations. Creepy, yeah. I was actively trying to forget as much of it as I could before I made some slip and gave away the truth. She raised a questioning eyebrow as I approached. She had a way of unleashing a frank gaze that no doubt served her well with suspects. It unsettled me, too, however hard I tried to pretend it didn't. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You look drained." Not a great turn of phrase, given what had been done to the victim. "Is there somewhere we can talk more privately?" "It's that bad?" "I think it might be, but obviously I can't discuss it if you need to make notes of our conversation." She looked amused. I guess I always said the same thing at this point. "Just between you and me, then." Zubrasky led me into a rundown, bay-windowed room that might once have held a dining table and chairs. Hideous, flowery wallpaper from the 1970s, all mustard and brown, covered the walls. It looked like the infestation of some malign creature, a mass of tentacles and watching eyes. Or maybe it was time I took a week or two off and did some walking in the Welsh hills to clear my head. "So, Acolyte Shahzan," said Zubrasky, "you believe this is a case of interest to Her Majesty's Office of the Witchfinder General?" "We will be investigating it further, yes," I said. "There are signs that evil and forbidden powers have been employed in that room." "Well, I'm only a simple police officer, but I did rather get that impression." She was playing with me. Our conversations often went like this, unsettling. I tried to ignore it. She was so together, and just then I wasn't. Some of the runes on that pentagram are quite disturbing, I said. Oh, they are? She obviously had no conception of the demonic forces besieging us. She doubtless thought the office was a bit of a joke. Fine, that was better than knowing the truth. Will the pentagram be part of the evidence you gather? I asked. Of course, it's clearly material. I'd like it to be erased as soon as possible. The fewer people who see it, the better. The pentagram is your main concern here? Without it, this looks like a simple enough case of aggravated murder. And you've been watching too much television. There is no such crime in this country. So much for trying to pretend I knew what I was talking about. I just mean, maybe you could mention the circle in evidence without including images of it? She hesitated for a moment, then conceded. A modern British judge or jury didn't need to know the details of magical runes. Very well. Good. I'll arrange for a team from the office to come along and destroy the sigils later today. The what? The markings on the floor. She nodded. Regardless of that, a crime has been committed. I have a duty to pursue it. I can't simply hand it over to you and walk away, not at this stage. It was the usual problem in these cases. There was no statute in British criminal or civil law outlawing the practice of the magical arts, at least not anymore. It was best for the public not to be aware such things existed. Her Majesty's Office of the Witchfinder General was, if anyone asked, an interesting historical anomaly, a ridiculous piece of quasi-medieval pageantry, like so much of the British governmental and judicial systems. The sombre men in wigs and tights, the archaic rituals at the opening of Parliament, the monarchy, the marble and gold palaces. It was a distraction, a cheap magician's misdirection. It was just a good job people didn't know the size of the office's annual budget or the number of people working for us up and down the country. We'd watched in amusement as MI5 and MI6 stepped out of the shadows to reassure the public by their presence. That wasn't our way at all. If the public suspected the tiniest amount of what we protected them from, they would be whatever the opposite of reassured was. I understand, I said. Can we at least agree to cooperate? Share information as our respective investigations unfold? She knew I was privileged, had the legal right to view all information uncovered by the police. Still, I preferred to maintain friendly relations if I could. It was surprising how disgruntled officers could lose vital information or forget to inform you of key details. And I very much wanted her to remain gruntled. The Crow had taught me well. Contacts in the force could often do things we could not, or at least do them more easily. Knocking on someone's door and showing them an Office of the Witchfinder General card rarely got you very far with the great British public. Most likely, it got you laughed at, or sworn at, or both. Just as long as it cuts both ways, she said. If you learn anything relevant to our investigation, I get to hear it, yes? The operative word there was, of course, relevant. There were lots of things I could decide were not relevant to the comfortable world of evidence and trials, things I would never, ever be allowed to tell her. Still, the more I could help her, the more she might help me. We were more or less on the same side. There was considerable overlap between criminal and magus law. A ritual murder upset us both. Plus, I needed all the help I could get at All Hallows. You have my word. There'll be an autopsy? I'm pretty sure we expect foul play, given the circumstances. We'll want to carry out our own equivalent investigation upon the body within the next few hours. I'm sure that can be arranged. as long as he isn't mutilated or tampered with any further. Arrange it through the usual channels. Can you tell me anything about the users now? Users. Magic users. People like Zubrasky know enough about the office to pick up on our slang. I'd prefer not to speculate. I have no insight into who might have done this or why. But you have seen something similar before. This thing with the eyes makes sense to you. It's common for people who know about the office to mix up what we do with the things those we pursue do, as if we are somehow complicit. In fact, the two are total opposites, the practice of evil and the attempt to stamp out that evil. But somehow the distinction eludes people. They think we routinely employ unnatural powers ourselves, as if that would ever be allowed. Or maybe they just think that some of the shit we wade through sticks to us. It doesn't make sense, I said, but we would like to investigate further. Her eyes sparkled with amusement as she listened. She was smart. She was winding me up with her insinuations. I let it happen every time. Well, she said, if you do hear any useful whispers from beyond the veil, you will let me know about it straight away, won't you? I tried to come up with a suitable reply, but before I could, she turned and left the room.